Trump has once again set foot on Chinese soil. Watching the diplomatic rhetoric of handshakes and negotiations in the news, you probably think that in this high-stakes game deciding the fate of nations for decades to come, the only players are China and the United States, right? But actually, while everyone was glued to the international spectacle, over 1,000 kilometers away in Seoul, South Korea, a group of people was hiding behind the scenes, popping who knows how many bottles of champagne to eye in the very days when Trump's visit to China dominated global headlines. South Korea's semiconductor titans delivered a staggering report card. Samsung Electronics' market capitalization shattered the historic $1 trillion mark. Meanwhile, SK Hynix, which holds a death grip on the global AI computing power supply, announced a cash-splashing plan worthy of the Korean industrial history books. They decided to take a record-breaking 10% of their profits and distribute it directly to 35,000 employees. Each person would take home roughly 700 million Korean won, about 3.2 million Chinese yuan. Some friends might say. So they handed out huge year-end bonuses. Plenty of rich companies do that. Is it really such a big deal? If that's what you think, you're underestimating the psychological impact this massive sum has on ordinary Koreans. You have to understand, in a hyper-competitive, deeply stratified society like South Korea, where the class hierarchy is set in stone, an ordinary young person could work themselves to death their entire life and still not scrape together a down payment for an apartment in Seoul. But now, if you work at SK Hynix, overnight, over 3 million yuan falls from the sky into your LAP.is. This called a bonus? No, this is mass-producing millionaires. It is precisely this brutally direct wealth explosion that completely shattered the psychological defenses of the Korean public, even triggering an almost pathological frenzy. These past few days on Korean social media, the ultimate flex is no longer driving a Porsche or wearing a Patek Philippe. If you can take a photo wearing an SK Hynix logo cleanroom suit and post it online, that is the pinnacle of showing off. Many of you are surely curious. Where exactly did this mind-boggling fortune come from? Let's shift our gaze to Icheon City in Gyeonggi Province. Inside the ultra-clean spaces here, the greatest and most exhilarating wealth adventure in human history is truly unfolding. Extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, each costing several $100 million, roar inside brilliantly lit workshops. Robotic arms, with nanometer-level precision, print high-bandwidth memory chips non-stop, day and night. Yes, riding the super hurricane of the AI explosion, this lithography machine is no longer just a machine. It is a money printer. It seems that as long as South Korea has enough of these machines, all Koreans will rise with the tide, lying back on the dividends of the AI era, living the good life with millions in year-end bonuses for everyone. But friends, this is just the story we see through our screens. The bottom layer of this world still operates on physical common sense, and no matter how advanced your chip manufacturing process is, no matter how fast this money printer spins it, ultimately does not run on hopes and dreams. That is so. When we pull our lens out from the spotless wafer fabrication plant, cut through the bustling Seoul metropolitan area, and fixate on the wilderness and muddy mountain roads of Gyeonggi Province, the scene changes completely. Far from the clamor of capital, there are no AI wealth creation myths. There are only red protest banners flying everywhere. The officials from the Korean Ministry of Energy dispatched to the scene, and the frontline engineers from Korea Electric Power Corporation find themselves in an absolute nightmare of frustration and desperation, because at this moment, they are facing emotionally charged farmers, clutching their tools and vowing to defend their land to the death, alongside local politicians who refuse to give an inch for the sake of votes. Why? Because for those money printers to run around the clock, they need to devour a terrifying amount of electricity. And that electricity must be transmitted through a power grid. To build that network, you must, in the real physical world, blast through mountains, dig trenches for power lines, and even forcibly occupy people's land. The result is that just to pull electricity in, even just to plant one extra high-voltage power pole, officials have to be pinned down in the mud, conducting grueling, humiliating negotiations that often end in failure. And this leads to the question, does South Korea really lack electricity that badly? Hello everyone. I am your new content creator, the Empty Mountain Hunter. Old fans who have been following my Empire of Power series will know that, according to the plan, this episode should have been about the United Kingdom. But South Korea has been scorching hot recently. I want to ride that wave of attention 2.0. Let's jump the queue today and talk about our neighbor. First, let's see exactly what is going on behind their trillion-dollar chip frenzy. Welcome to the Empire of Power series. South Korea, as you all probably know, the explosion of generative AI in the last 2 years has completely overturned the rules of the global computing power game. If NVIDIA's GPUs are the brains handling the calculations, then HBM is the main artery frantically pumping blood into that brain. Those obsolete, traditional memory chips from the past could never hope to feed today's ravenous GPUs. Whoever can master HBM right now becomes the last hope of the village that all the AI giants are frantically scrambling for. And on this strategic choke point that will determine the direction of technology for the next decade, the Republic of Korea has dug an incredibly formidable moat. SK Hynix, 69% global market share. Samsung Electronics, 13%. This means that just these two Korean chaebols hold a death grip on nearly 90% of global HBM production capacity. This absolute monopoly has elevated a tiny piece of silicon into the ultimate bargaining chip in the great power game. You want a seat at the AI table? Fine. You have to see if the Koreans allow it first. Sounds like the Koreans have already won the jackpot, right? Don't be so hasty. Usually, the gifts bestowed by fate come with a price tag already secretly attached. Beneath the throne of the digital empire, the price of power is staggering. Now, let's cut to the inside of SK Hynix's most advanced wafer fab. This man is Kim Tae-young, a senior process engineer at this moment. His eyes are locked dead onto a red reading on the master control screen. The voltage fluctuation value. His palms are covered in cold sweat. You might ask, why is a tech master who builds chips sweating over a voltage meter? Because in front of him, running at full tilt, is that steel behemoth worth several $100 million, representing the limits of human manufacturing, the extreme ultraviolet lithography machine. I mentioned in the Lithography Shadow War episode of my Top Predator Hunt series that every time this machine fires its plasma, it instantaneously consumes over 1 megawatt of electricity to ensure its normal operation. It needs not only a massive air conditioning array around it, constantly maintaining absolute temperature and humidity in the cleanroom, but even the number of dust particles in the air is maniacally restricted to single digits. But that's not enough. It also requires a colossal ultra-pure water circulation system to carry away the immense heat it generates. Inside this ultra-clean space, what engineers fear most is not mechanical failure or hacker viruses. It is a zero point 0.1 second voltage SAG in the blink of an eye. If the grid experiences a microsecond level fluctuation, the extremely fragile vacuum environment inside the lithography machine will collapse instantly. Wafers worth tens of millions of dollars on the production line will, in a split second, all turn into piles of worthless scrap glass. 99.999%. This is the ironclad command the Korean semiconductor industry gives to the national power grid. Absolute stability. Not a single interruption can be tolerated. Yes, behind the taut nerves of Master Kim, here lies the entire silicon-based empire's boundless fear of and hunger for electricity. But this is only the beginning. To definitively lock in victory in the future Silicon Wars, the Korean government and its chaebols are preparing to pour $470 billion directly into the wilderness of Gyeonggi Province to build from scratch the world's largest semiconductor supercluster, the Yongin supercluster. But hidden behind this Yongin blueprint lies a fatal flaw. According to authoritative calculations released by the Korean government itself, once this Yongin industrial complex alone is fully operational, its power demand will reach 16 gigawatts. Now, many of you might not have a concrete idea of what 16 gigawatts means. Don't worry, let's compare it to the entire nation of South Korea. Currently, South Korea's national peak electricity load, maxed out, is just around 100 gigawatts. This means that even if all Korean citizens never buy a single new home appliance ever again, this one Yongin industrial complex alone would gobble up over 15% of the nation's entire electricity supply. That if we perform an equivalent substitution in the real physical world, to meet this 16 gigawatts of absolutely uninterruptible baseload power, South Korea would need to build at least 10 to 15 new large-scale nuclear reactors. I'm not sure how much you know about South Korea's geography, but this country's total area is, at best, comparable to China's Zhejiang province. And of this tiny area, 70% is continuous mountainous terrain, with precious little habitable plain, leading to an insane population density. Even more critically, South Korea sits near fault lines and gets rattled by earthquakes from time to time. Just think about it. Ever since the Fukushima nuclear disaster in neighboring Japan, the mere mention of the words nuclear reactor sends Korean citizens into sheer terror. In this tiny, mountain-crowded, overpopulated, earthquake-prone place, your Korean government now has to go to its people and say, to make chips, we need to cram 15 more nuclear power plants into this country. In the eyes of the Korean public, what's the difference between that and burying 15 ticking nuclear time bombs beneath their feet? Who would dare let you build? So, time shifts to early summer 2026 in Seoul. At a closed-door debate, the Korean Ministry of Energy drops an utterly shocking warning report. The report points out that due to the chaotic expansion of AI data centers and the exponential jump in semiconductor production capacity, South Korea's electricity demand has completely deviated from the steady growth trajectory of past decades, plunging into a terrifying phase of exponential explosion. In the past, the electricity consumption increase from semiconductors and data centers accounted for only 10% of the national total. That proportion has now barreled headlong to 26%. Officials are forced to swallow hard and predict that if things keep burning at this rate. By 2040, South Korea's national peak electricity demand will surge nearly 40%. In my previous videos, I've been repeating this line to you all. The end of algorithms is computing power, and the end of computing power is electricity. So here comes the most fatal question. In a country with no land to spare and no resources to tap, where on earth will South Korea's electricity come from? Some might think, electricity. South Korea is a developed country after all, rich and powerful. Is that even a problem? Just throw money at building more power plants. Problem solved, right? Friends, just one glance at a nighttime satellite map will reveal that on the true energy map, South Korea is not a peninsula at all. It is a sealed-off, inescapable island with no retreat. Because of over half a century of political and military isolation, South Korea's grid is physically severed from the vast Eurasian continent. It cannot, like France and Germany, rely on cross-border grids to borrow emergency power from neighbors when supplies run short. It also has zero oil or gas pipelines connecting it to the continent. Thus, to keep this semiconductor empire running day and night, every single kilowatt-hour of electricity generated and every drop of oil consumed in South Korea must drift across the long and immensely perilous oceans. This is the first noose tightening around South Korea's neck, the lifeline of fossil fuels. Data from 2024 shows that 60% of South Korea's electricity still relies on burning coal and liquefied natural gas. And when it comes to crude oil imports, nearly 70% depends entirely on the perpetually war-torn Middle East. The breadth of this silicon-based empire hinges desperately on the choke points of the Strait of Hormuz and the Strait of Malacca. If the Middle East so much as sneezes, or if a stray bullet carelessly hits an oil tanker, the chaebol bosses in Seoul will break out in cold sweats in the middle of the night. If dependence on foreign fossil fuels is an internal wound for South Korea, then what comes next, a green ultimatum from across the ocean, directly puts a knife to the throat of Korean semiconductors to eye in the conference rooms of Silicon Valley and Brussels. The titans are reshaping the rules of the global game. Apple, Google, Microsoft, these tech overlords who control the fate of global consumer markets have, to achieve their own carbon neutrality goals, forced a brutally stringent initiative onto the entire supply chain. 100% renewable energy, known as RE100. Following that, the European Union has wielded the big stick of carbon tariffs. Friends, as we've said in previous series, in the 21st century, green environmentalism is no longer just a moral slogan politicians shout at climate conferences. It has transformed into the coldest, most lethal commercial barrier. The rules set by the West are incredibly domineering. No matter how powerful your chip's computing capability, no matter how advanced your manufacturing process, if your production line does not use green power like wind or solar, you will face destructive carbon tariff penalties, or even be kicked straight out of the core bidding group chat. And facing this green noose, South Korea's report card is shockingly poor. The global average share of renewable energy, 30.25%, the average for advanced economies, 33.49%, and South Korea, a pitiful 9.64%. For Samsung and SK Hynix, the crisis is already at their doorstep. Without green electricity, they will be forcibly squeezed out of the global core supply chain. Hearing this, you might want to ask, then why not massively build solar and wind power? As we mentioned earlier, South Korea's land is inherently cramped. 70% is mountainous. To deploy solar panels on a large scale, the cost is astronomically high. They would even have to raze entire forests. But this is not the most critical problem. The deadliest issue lies in a fundamental conflict with the laws of physics. Do you remember that lithography machine we talked about at the beginning? The one that cannot tolerate a 0.1 second voltage fluctuation? It demands 99.999% absolutely stable base load power. And what is the nature of wind and solar power generation? It relies on the mercy of the weather. When the wind stops, the power cuts out. When clouds roll in, the power weakens. Entrusting this intermittent, inherently fragile force of nature to serve a wafer foundry that demands absolute power stability is a recipe for utter disaster. The geographical cage of an island, the geopolitical noose on its shipping lanes, the West's green trade barriers. These three lethal, interlocking traps have driven South Korea straight into a dead end. The most advanced digital productivity is about to be slowly strangled to death by the most backward physical energy supply. And if this empire wants to survive, if it wants to remain at the AI wars card table, it must complete a painful, resolute, and even heretical strategic blitz on the energy front, facing power-guzzling monsters ahead and a green stick behind. The dual pressure finally jolted South Korea's decision-makers into a cold sweat. After crunching the numbers, they have clearly seen the survival game of the 21st century, relying on their own patch of exorbitantly expensive, intermittently twitching wind and solar power to realize the grand dream of a semiconductor empire. That's pure delusion. After learning through bitter experience to survive the Silicon Wars, South Korea must make a resolute choice that defies Western environmental dogma and even completely overturns the political legacy of the previous administration. And so, we witness a highly dramatic U-turn. When the Yoon Suk-yeol government took office, it immediately executed a 180-degree extreme pivot. It publicly tore up the nuclear phase-out policy, pushed by its predecessor into shreds. The IT pivoted entirely towards a nuclear renaissance, even elevating nuclear power to the highest national policy for defending the country's economic security. But the Koreans are shrewd. They understand crystal clear in their hearts. Secretly building nuclear power plants at home alone is utterly useless if they don't break the RE100 greenwashing dogma imposed by Western giants like Apple and Microsoft. No matter how powerful the chips Korea makes are, those companies can still kick them out of the supply chain under the pretext of being environmentally unfriendly. Since your rules are designed to kill me, sorry then, I'll just flip the table. And so, a fiercely strategic international diplomatic brawl commenced. The South Korean government directly stormed onto the international stage, unyieldingly throwing down its own set of new rules. The Carbon-Free Energy Initiative. In this initiative, the Koreans practically pointed at the noses of the West and questioned, "You Western nations are secretly frantically restarting nuclear power yourselves. So what gives you the right to turn around and mandate that only wind and solar count as green energy for us? Nuclear power also emits zero carbon dioxide. Why shouldn't it be included in the global supply chain's green assessment system?" To forcibly shake up these hegemonic Western rules, South Korea swiftly assembled an incredibly formidable industrial national team. Samsung, SK Hynix, Hyundai. These 20 chaebols and major emitters controlling the lifeblood of the Korean economy formed a blood oath alliance. establishing the mighty CFE alliance. Carrying lobbying briefcases stuffed with US dollars, they frantically rushed around the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and the United Arab Emirates, trying to drag every country with a nuclear power tradition into their camp, attempting to forcibly rewrite the carbon neutrality rulebook for the global supply chain. And while furiously lobbying and building cliques internationally, South Korea's domestic nuclear power blitz had also kicked off. The newly finalized 11th long-term power supply and demand basic plan drew up an immensely grand, yet deeply tragic, roadmap for the nation. The government issued a direct, non-negotiable order. By 2038, the total share of carbon-free energy must be forcefully dragged from under 40% all the way up to 70.7%. Among this, the undisputed main force responsible for frantically infusing power into the nation's computing base was assigned to nuclear power at 35.2%. It to fill the terrifying 16-gigawatt fatal gap we mentioned for the Yongin semiconductor cluster. The government demands that at least 2 new large-scale nuclear reactors be built from scratch before 2038, while also launching a mad rush to deploy more flexible small modular reactors that a desperate all-out counterattack, mobilized by the entire nation, seems to be about to begin. But pay attention, I said seems. Inside the offices of the presidential Blue House, it's easy to draw up blueprints and shout slogans. But to actually implement this plan in the muddy, messy reality, the phrase, weighing 1,000 pounds, probably best captures the despair and suffocation involved. 2 o'clock in the morning. The team responsible for nuclear power plant site selection is exhausted to the breaking point. Inside this conference room cluttered with cigarette butts and coffee cups, the long table is covered with thick geological survey maps, stacked next to analysis reports on the political factions of various metropolitan and provincial governments. The engineers' eyes are bloodshot, and the hands holding red pens are trembling, because they know all too well that in today's South Korea, trying to find a site that is geologically stable, has sufficient cooling water, and, most critically, can be grudgingly accepted by the local population, is harder than reaching the heavens in a crowded place like South Korea. Anytime you draw a circle on a map, the next day it triggers a protest storm that shakes the local political landscape, with multiple factions brawling in the streets. But the countdown of the Grim Reaper is already ticking loudly. They must restart the site selection process overnight, fighting to forcibly get the construction permits approved by the early 2030 ESTA. And if they fail, the entire expansion plan of the Korean semiconductor empire will be strangled, stuck dead in the physical impossibility of having no electricity, becoming a complete laughingstock. The strategic awakening from nuclear phase-out to nuclear embrace was a heavy punch thrown with all of South Korea's might against destiny. Yet this very punch, before it could even land on its Western competitors, was about to rebound viciously and smash into the hardest wall of all, South Korea's own social system. That is a chasm between the power plant and the wafer fab, filled with rage, blood, and votes. Actually, the fatal pain point of South Korea's power system can be summed up in 4 words: spatial mismatch. Let's take a look at the map. To do nuclear power. To do thermal power, you need seawater cooling, right? So, for safety reasons, South Korea's frantic baseload power plants are mostly built on the eastern coastline. But what's the problem? The power-guzzling semiconductor monsters, which gobble up 40% of the nation's electricity in one gulp, are all clustered in the western capital region. They are separated by a vast distance. To open up this energy meridian to send electricity from east to west. The Korean government had to bite the bullet and plan an epic super project. A 280-kilometer-long high-voltage direct current transmission artery. Along this path, they would have to erect 436 steel transmission towers, each dozens of meters high. Just when they were about to complete it, nobody expected this artery, crucial to the fate of the Republic of Korea, would be seized by the throat just one step from the finish line. And the one choking the Korean ship artery is not the United States, nor some competitor. It's their own people. The mayor of Hanam City, Gyeonggi Province, Lee Hyun-jae, this maverick local official, with an extremely hardline stance, directly wielded his administrative veto power and blocked the expansion permit for the East Seoul converter station. His stated reasons were righteous and noble. Concerns about electromagnetic wave radiation affecting citizens' health and damaging the city's landscape. Actually, anyone with even a little understanding of political maneuvering knows this. Is outright blackmail of the national will, using local votes as leverage to exchange for this tiny permit. The mayor made an outrageous demand of Korea Electric Power Corporation. You want to transmit power through my territory? Fine. First, pay to build a luxurious art center in my city for free. Even after the superior-level Gyeonggi Province Administrative Appeals Committee clearly ruled that this mayor's actions were illegal, the local government still had 3 words. We don't care. Not a single inch was conceded. This typical, not in my backyard attitude directly triggered a catastrophic systemic collapse. Because the throat of the main transmission artery is severed, the electricity generated by those nuclear and thermal power plants on the East Coast simply cannot be sent out. Equipment utilization rates have been forced to plunge to 20%. This is equivalent to up to 4 gigawatts of power, matching the full load electricity of 3 entire nuclear power plants, being locked up in vain on the beach, power generated but undeliverable, while the wafer fabs in the West are howling in desperation. If this deadlock isn't broken, the grand 16-gigawatt promise of the Yongin semiconductor cluster is nothing but a worthless piece of papered at this point. Let's flash back to that utterly absurd scene at the beginning of our video. There stand several frontline engineers from KEPCO. They originally represented the nation's supreme will to advance infrastructure, and now they are standing alone under the scorching sun, engaging in a humiliating solo protest, holding up signs. Their placards helplessly read, "Electricity supply cannot wait any longer." Can you believe this? A state-owned monopoly giant, supposedly the iron backbone in charge of the entire national grid, has been reduced to a vulnerable group begging a local mayor for approval. Seeing this, many of you might be baffled. Where is the top brass? Where is the president? Facing such a roadblock, can't they just do this or that? But the matter isn't that simple on the issue of the power grid. Korean society carries a historical scar that still bleeds to this day. That let's turn back the clock. Over a decade, to 2008, there was an incident that shocked the entire nation of South Korea. It is called the Millionaires incident. Back then, also to build high-voltage transmission towers, to protect ancestral graves and farmland from the shadow of 765 kilovolt steel giants. Elderly men and women in Millionaires, in their 70s and 80s, pitched tents in the mountains and held sleep-in protests that lasted for years, facing the shields of riot police and the relentless advance of heavy machinery. A 78-year-old peasant woman named Sun Huijiang burst out with that desperate cry that shook the whole nation. Unless you step over my dead body. Even more tragically, a 74-year-old farmer named Li Jiwoon, to demonstrate his protest, to force the construction team to retreat, doused himself in gasoline and set himself on fire in public. That brutally tragic protest deeply tore Korean society apart. Since then, the words transmission tower have become a political minefield in South Korea. Whoever touches them is blown to smithereens. Back to today. On one side, you have SK Hynix, antsy as a cat on a hot tin roof, waiting for electricity to print money. On the other side, you have an unyielding local mayor and a public opinion minefield ready to explode on contact. Driven into a corner with no way out, the Korean government had to swallow its pride and make an immensely expensive, deeply humiliating engineering compromise that forcibly delivered the urgently needed initial 3 gigawatts of life-saving power to the Yongin wafer fabs. They abandoned the most efficient and cheapest traditional method of high-altitude transmission towers. What did they do instead? They decided to follow local road 318, which connects Yongin and Icheon, and use the roadworks as a chance to bury those high-voltage cables, thicker than a man's thigh, underground like thieves. The undergrounding of cables did indeed successfully circumvent land disputes and public protests. But it also directly caused the construction costs to skyrocket by over tenfold. The previously clear construction timeline has been stretched indefinitely. The story seems to have been resolved here, no matter what, right? No, there's still one more question, and that is, who will ultimately foot this astronomically bloated repair bill? This impossible accounting mess. Under the blinding white glare of floodlights, excavators are struggling to advance through the muddy, deep trenches. These high-voltage cables, thicker than a man's thigh, are like infusion tubes forcibly keeping the semiconductor empire on life support, being hauled and stuffed into the ground by workers in the muck. The project progresses at a snail's pace, but the countdown from Silicon Valley is accelerating at a suffocating speed. That on the other side of the Pacific, the iteration cycle for large model computing power has terrifyingly shortened from years to months. Phone calls from tech giants frantically urging HBM chip deliveries ring day and night into the Chaebol headquarters in Seoul. The wildly aggressive expansion speed of the digital world is mercilessly tearing at the construction limits of the physical world. Koreans have suddenly realized that relying on one corporation to fight a life or death battle against a local government, even relying on a near-bankrupt national utility like KEPCO, is simply not enough to win this infrastructure blitz involving national destiny. Since conventional means lead nowhere, they must deploy the ultimate machinery of the state. Time moves to the end of 2024 at the National Assembly building in Uido, Seoul. After countless fierce arguments, compromises, and filthy horse trading, an exceptionally rare piece of legislation, tinged with heavy-handed authoritarianism, is urgently placed on the voting table of the Korean National Assembly. The Special Act on National Grid Expansion. In this nation that highly prizes local autonomy and democratic votes. This is practically an anti-conventional wartime decree that directly elevates transmission network construction from a corporate activity to the highest national security strategy. The core logic of this act is simple. Directly strip all local governments of their intervention rights. If any local mayor dares to strangle the process with permits in the future, sorry, The central government will directly draw its imperial sword and forcibly approve. Over local heads. Not only that, but national finances enter the game directly, using astronomical compensation money to knock out the expropriated farmers and massive infrastructure support funds to feed the local politicians willing to accept high-voltage lines. South Korea is using the steel meat grinder of national will to forcibly crush the long and fatal social friction inherent in a democratic system. But in the face of the 16-gigawatt monstrous appetite of the computing power black hole, unclogging the grid only solves the immediate crisis. To stay at the card table for the next 20 years of the Silicon Wars, South Korea must play its last and craziest card. Since people protest building nuclear power plants on remote coastlines, and since local governments obstruct building hundreds of kilometers of transmission towers, the Koreans have come up with the ultimate solution. Why must we build a grid at all? What if we move the nuclear reactor directly into the Seoul metropolitan area, right next door to the semiconductor factories? SMR, small modular reactors. Friends, this is the most radical, the craziest industrial concept in human nuclear history. Its size is just 1% of a traditional nuclear plant that it can be mass manufactured directly on a factory assembly line. Just like building cars. Once built, it can be loaded like a shipping container, trucked to the side of a wafer fab, assembled on site, and generate power on the spot. What about cooling? Don't worry, the city's industrial water supply can handle it. What about grid resistance? Don't worry, that problem simply doesn't exist. Because the reactor would be less than a kilometer away from the lithography machine. For this ultimate plan, wrapped in super sci-fi colors, South Korea's chaebols have mobilized en masse. SK Group directly poured hundreds of millions of dollars to invest in TerraPower, the leading USSMR company backed by Bill Gates. Samsung C&T and Hyundai Engineering and Construction have thrown all the manufacturing prowess accumulated over decades in South Korea's shipbuilding and heavy industry sectors into the modular forging of reactors. They are attempting to create an unprecedented industrial spectacle on the Korean peninsula. In this mad vision, there are no long transmission lines. No layer upon layer of loss along the way. There is only the vast energy generated by nuclear fission, instantaneously converted within a few hundred meters into the extreme ultraviolet light that etches silicon wafers inside the lithography machine. This is the ultimate all-in gamble, wagering national destiny. The Koreans are not only trying to forcibly sell the political logic that nuclear power is green power to the West, they are also trying, at the absolute limit of physics, to bind nuclear energy and computing power together inseparably. This is their only antidote to breaking free from the geographical prison. Over half a century ago, on this barren peninsula that had endured a brutal civil war and possessed no natural resources, Koreans, through sheer desperation and hard work, forged steel and built ships, creating the miracle on the Han River, cutting a bloody path out from the edge of the world. Today, history seems to have completed an astonishing cycle in this new era, nominally called the digital economy, but in reality a slaughterhouse of heavy industry. The Republic of Korea still has no oil, no vast land, no cross-border grids. What they hold in their hands remains only their ultimate precision manufacturing, and that national will which, when forced to the brink in a crisis, always seems to erupt with astonishing energy. Outside the window lies the wilderness of Gyeonggi Province, being bulldozed flat. cranes stand in the night like a steel forest. Because in the foundational operating logic of this nation, everyone understands clearer than anyone else. No matter how elegantly you write your code, you can never violate the second law of thermodynamics. And no matter how intelligent you make your algorithm, it must still bow down to the old alternating current. People are always easily intoxicated by the illusions of AI, naively believing that just sitting in front of a screen, tapping on a keyboard, can lead to an omnipotent future. But on this land of the Republic of Korea, a silent physical war is declaring a cold, hard truth to the entire world that I dedicate this closing thought to South Korea, which is currently barreling ahead in a desperate situation. But in this world, not all countries defend their power grid with their lives as national destiny, the way South Korea does. For certain old empires, the national grid, the public baseline. What even is that? It's simply one perfect ATM machine. As I said at the beginning of the video. According to the plan for our Empire of Power series, this episode was originally supposed to be about the United Kingdom, that if South Korea's crisis today is the helplessness of digital economic expansion crashing against physical limits, then Britain's crisis is a pure, utterly shameless financial heist, while the chaebols and engineers of the Republic of Korea are desperately, with bloodshot eyes, trying to shove nuclear reactors beneath Seoul. The lords of the British Empire are sitting in their warm, cozy mansions, counting the hundreds of billions in dividends extracted from ordinary people's electricity bills with a clear conscience. And beneath them, on the streets of London, lie countless lower-class citizens frozen to death in the bitter cold, their doors smashed in because they couldn't afford to pay their power bills. In the next episode, we will cross the Eurasian continent, turning back the clock 40 years to London to witness firsthand how that so-called great adventure of electricity privatization, hailed by Margaret Thatcher, methodically bled an once glorious industrial empire dry, sucking the marrow from its bones until it became an empty shell. Making money is nothing to be ashamed of. But just how ugly can the feasting get? Remember to subscribe. Join me for our next installment of Empire of Power, the United Kingdom. I'll see you there.